Well, I somehow convinced Joel Nelson to put his rod down for a little bit with walleyes under the boat, because I've got a few questions that were submitted to the Target Walleye email address that I thought he'd be a good fit to answer. So I'm just going to jump right in here. This first question is a guy who's been a diehard spinner and minnow fisherman for 30 plus years, catches a lot of fish, but wants to try new things to catch bigger ones instead of all the eaters. It says there's lots of shallow weeds on the lake. I'm assuming just from reading this that he's pulling spinners on the outside. Joel, what are some things that, different techniques or ways that you would target maybe bigger fish instead of smaller eaters?
That's a good question. It's a long question. It's somewhat involved, but I'll try and break it down in a digestible piece. I think first and foremost, he's come to understand that, he wants to try and catch some bigger fish, and setting expectations is a big part of that. You have to understand that big fish are rare, and if you're going to be learning new techniques on top of that, you've got this double whammy situation where you're learning, maybe not as good at the technique as you will become, and there's just not as many big fish as there are smaller fish. So I think setting expectations appropriately is a big thing off the bat. But in terms of ways to target bigger fish specifically, you need to fish a little differently. You need to fish a lot often with larger baits, more aggressively during key windows, low light periods, big winds. Seasonally, you need to think in terms of where are those big fish opportunities. I think of fall as a great time of year. I think of the early season as another great time of year. I think of nighttime. I think of nighttime trolling, specifically out in the open water. If it's a tulipy system where there's big baits and big bait fish, big walleyes congregate out in the open, clear water environments, and learning how to troll suspended at night can be a great way to target big fish. Going back to fall, rigging big minnows, big chubs is a wonderful big fish technique. It takes some practice. Heavier weights sometimes to keep those bigger minnows down, putting it in front of their face, and then when you feel the bite, making sure to pay the fish enough line and give it what it needs to actually get that minnow up to the hook, and then be able to set the hook appropriately. So right there, fishing cranks suspended at night, and then also fishing bigger minnows in the fall time of year, and just larger baits overall in general, and casting them rather than so much dragging live bait around for the eaters program is what you're going to have to switch to in terms of tactics. And like I said, be prepared for some struggles off the get-go, but that's what makes it that much more sweet when you do start connecting with big fish more often.
Awesome. Say if he's got a couple of specific weed beds that he knows holds walleye, maybe up shallow, that you couldn't pull spinners through.
Sure.
Is there anything that you would recommend, or how would you sort of approach that weed bite?
The weed bite, I'm not a great weed angler, but I like doing a couple specific things. And first and foremost, when wind is coming into these weed beds, a lot of times those walleyes raise just a little bit, and they will come up and out of those weeds a great deal further in terms of depth than a lot of people think. So you can actually cast jigs and plastics over the tops of those things and bring them, and walleyes will come up and just crack them when you've got a good steady wind blowing into those weed beds. In a similar situation, if you've got a large expanse that you want to cover, pulling planer boards and spinners, putting that board right over the tops of those weeds with not too much lead line off of your spinners, and just kind of trickling those spinners through the weed bed slowly. Another great way to catch big weed bed walleyes.
Awesome. I'm convinced some of those fish up in those weed beds haven't seen a bait. Walleye guys are scared of shallow water.
For sure, absolutely. Hey, I'm one of them and have been for a long time. It takes some convincing for me to get up there, but a lot of times I'm happy when I do.
Awesome. Another question here. Lake of the Woods can be a whole lot of fun, but for many it's not accessible because of boat sizes, guide fees, etc. Are there budget-friendly ways that somebody else could enjoy this fishery?
Yeah, in fact, it's a really good question, and a question that when I answer might seem like a no-brainer, but at the same time it bears repeating. On the south side of Lake of the Woods is a really well-developed group of establishments that are really good at housing people, feeding people, having bar and other resources available on the South Shore. They'll take you out fishing. It's a charter situation where you're out there with a bunch of people. It's a really friendly environment, a lot of camaraderie, and typically the bite is really good. And then they usher you back. They'll either clean your fish for you, you can clean them yourselves, there's good meals involved. It's a really economical way to get introduced to the fishery. It's how most people get introduced to Lake of the Woods. I know myself personally, I'm from a number of hours away. That's how I got introduced to it. It's wonderful because that serves as a real gateway for you to get up here, dip your toes in the water, not spend a ton of money, and see exactly what it is all about. For scores of anglers, that's the experience they want moving forward for the rest of their lives. And others will say, you know what, that's great. I like that a lot. I might do that every other year, but then I also want to try and take my own boat up eventually. And getting up here and seeing what the bite is all about really informs your next steps moving forward.
Awesome step for sure. Let's see here next. What size bottom bouncer weight is best to use at the depth you're in, trolling speed, etc.? Guys looking for just kind of general guidelines for weight compared to depth for bottom bouncers.
Sure. You know, there's some really great graphics online that Northland Tackle has that'll give you really exacting information. And it always is going to vary based on how fast you're pulling, and then also wind, right? Big wind and big waves and big swells will pull your bouncer off bottom. So you need to adjust based on the conditions you have, but as a real general rule of thumb, something simple, something that doesn't always apply based on conditions, but something that I just use as a starting guideline is the 1, 2, 3 rule. 0 to 10, 1 ounce. 10 to 20, 2 ounces. 20 to 30, 3 ounces. Start there, adjust as needed. Very rarely is there such a thing as too much weight unless you're in heavy rocks, because you don't want that thing to keep banging in there and eventually possibly getting stuck. But that 1, 2, 3 rule is about as easy as it comes, and that's what I've always used to start off and go from there.
Yep, you got it. Let's do one more. I would love to know if your plan is to look for fish before you wet a line, or are you planning on trolling to locate fish and then, you know, picking them apart?
Sure. Varies quite heavily based on the body of water. Really basic systems that are small, I tend to think of, well, hey, maybe there's not great mapping. I'm probably just gonna have to get out there and start poking around, and trolling's a great way to do that. Other systems, which are a little bit bigger, maybe there's better mapping for, I can sit in my boat in the garage and just start pushing buttons and really start developing a plan based on prevailing westerly wind patterns, based on the weather that I'm facing. But the answer is most often and unequivocally both. I mark up a map. I'm a map nerd like crazy, and I mark up a map when I can in preparation, but then I tend to start with more quick-paced trolling type applications to start finding fish before I settle in on them. I use my graph and electronics then to figure out, are these fish off bottom? Are they tightly congregated? Are they spread across an expanse? And especially when I'm learning and they're spread out, trolling's the name of the game.
Yeah, I like it. That shallow deal in small lakes like you were talking about though,
Yeah.
it's like a lot of times you just got to go fish. I mean, you're not going to graph those fish if they're up in 7 to 9 foot weeds. They're going to spook before you ever get in there.
Right.
And that's just logging hours and trying to get bites. And but man, once they're out over that like 20-foot stuff, 30-foot stuff,
Yep.
I put on miles cruising around looking for fish and trying to save time. But it just, like you said, water clarity. They're spooking before you ever grab them, or it's shallow. That's tough. You almost got to fish through them.
Yeah, and I tell you what, some of the people I take out on my boat get a little frustrated at first because we'll spend an hour, sometimes 2 hours before we ever wet a line. That, for a lot of people, isn't what they're looking for, so have to manage that side of it too.
Test some friendship.
Right.
No, well, I really appreciate it, Joel. I got a bunch more questions here, but running out of time, so we might have to hop on and do this again soon.
Not for now. We're gonna fish.
Yeah, break.